The wind was howling through the tall pines that evening in the tiny town of Pine Creek, where the past always seemed to linger. Sheriff John Carmichael was used to hearing old legends and stories whispered around campfires, but he never believed he'd stumble onto one himself, especially not one buried in the town's own history. Pine Creek was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the air smelled of fresh rain and the scent of cedar. But in the late summer of 1975, the sleepy town would wake up to a mystery that had been sleeping for nearly half a century. It all started with an old, yellowed letter that showed up in the sheriff's office mailbox. No return address, no signature, just a single line that read, "The class of 1930 never left." Sheriff Carmichael didn't know what to make of it at first. He figured it was some local prank or one of the kids trying to stir up trouble. But as he looked closer, he felt a chill run down his spine. He was a man who believed in facts and evidence, not ghost stories or town gossip. But that letter seemed to carry the weight of something real, something waiting to be uncovered. Sheriff Carmichael's curiosity got the best of him. He decided to head to the county records office, a dusty little room in the back of the town hall where old newspapers and school documents lay stacked in boxes that hadn't been touched in decades. He'd been there 100 times before, mostly to file incident reports or check property lines. But that day, he was looking for something different. He was looking for the class of 1930. As he flipped through the faded yearbooks and attendance sheets, he realized something was missing. The class photo from 1930 was gone, like it had never existed. There were no graduation records, no teacher's notes, no newspaper clippings about the annual field trip or the school play. It was as if an entire group of children had been swallowed by time itself. The sheriff felt a knot in his stomach. He couldn't help but wonder how this could have happened. Pine Creek wasn't a big place, and the school had always been the heart of the community. How could a whole class just disappear? The deeper he dug, the stranger it got. Some of the older folks in town, the ones who spent their afternoons rocking on front porches, started to talk in hushed voices. They mentioned names he'd never heard before, children who had lived down by the river, families who had packed up and vanished overnight. But when he asked them for details, their eyes went cloudy, and they'd shake their heads, as if the memories were too heavy to bring to the surface. Sheriff Carmichael's search led him to the school building itself, a 2-story brick structure that still stood at the edge of town. The place had been closed for years, but he managed to find an old janitor who still had the keys. The floors creaked under his boots as he stepped into the darkened hallways, the smell of chalk and old wood filling the air. He could almost hear the echoes of laughter and the clatter of pencils on desks. But what he found was silence. In one of the classrooms, he noticed something odd. There was a row of desks that looked untouched, as if they'd been left exactly how the children had left them on the last day of school. Old textbooks, half-finished spelling tests, a single mitten left behind on a chair. It felt like the kids had just gotten up and walked out, and never came back. On the blackboard, written in faded chalk, were the words, "We will return." The sheriff knew he had to find answers. But the more he learned, the more questions he had. Who were these children? Why had no one spoken of them in all these years? And what happened on that final day of class? He couldn't let it go. It wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It felt personal. These kids had been forgotten, their names wiped from the town's memory. And he couldn't let that stand. He took the names he could find from the few scraps of paper that remained and started knocking on doors. Some of the older families still living in Pine Creek remembered faint details, stories of children who had been part of the town's Indigenous community. They spoke of a day when the children went to school and never came home. But every time Sheriff Carmichael thought he was getting close, the stories would slip away like smoke. People were scared to talk, or maybe they were just scared of what they might remember. Then came a break. Sheriff Carmichael got a tip from an old-timer who lived out by the edge of the forest. He said he remembered something from that day, A sound, a scream, and then silence. He wouldn't say much more, but he gave the sheriff a name, Old Man Henry. Henry was a recluse who lived in a cabin deep in the woods, and he'd always been the keeper of the town's darkest secrets. If anyone knew what happened, it was him. The sheriff set out at dawn, driving through the winding forest roads that twisted like the mystery he was trying to solve. As he got closer to Henry's cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees whispering in the wind. By the time he reached the cabin, his hands were slick with sweat. Henry was a thin, weathered man with eyes as sharp as broken glass. He didn't smile when a sheriff knocked on his door. Instead, he stood there in the doorway, waiting. "I know why you're here," he said, his voice rough and low. "You're looking for the children, aren't you?" Sheriff Carmichael nodded. He could feel the weight of Henry's gaze, like the old man could see right into his soul. "They never left," Henry said. "They're still out there, waiting." The sheriff didn't know what to say. He wanted to push for answers, to force the truth out of Henry, but the old man just shook his head and turned away. "You don't understand," he said. "This town, it's built on old promises. The children were taken, but not in the way you think. There are things out here in these woods that don't forget, and they don't forgive." The words sent a shiver down the sheriff's spine. He realized then that this wasn't just a story about missing kids. It was a story about something older, something that had been buried under the weight of time and silence. And he wasn't sure he was ready to hear the rest. As the sun dipped below the trees, Sheriff Carmichael stood outside Henry's cabin, the forest dark and endless around him. He knew he couldn't walk away now, not when he was this close. He had to know the truth, even if it meant digging up secrets that the town of Pine Creek had spent decades trying to forget. What happened to the children of 1930? Why were they erased from the records? And what was it that kept them hidden all these years? Sheriff Carmichael's search had only just begun, and the shadows of the past were waiting to be found. The forest seemed to press in on Sheriff Carmichael as he stood outside that lonely cabin, the last rays of sun flickering through the trees like dying embers. Old Man Henry hadn't given him much, just enough to twist the knot in his stomach a little tighter. "They're still out there," he'd said, his voice carrying a weight that felt older than the town itself. But what did that mean? Were the children lost to time? Or was there something else? Something hidden in those deep woods, waiting in the shadows? Sheriff Carmichael climbed back into his truck and drove the winding dirt road back toward town, headlights carving out a path through the darkness. He couldn't stop thinking about the missing class, about the children's names he had found in those yellowed records. One name stuck with him, Mary Little Bird. She was only 8 when she vanished, her face a blur in the single newspaper clipping he'd managed to find. The caption read, "A bright light in our little school. She had dreams like any child." But what happened to her? Back in Pine Creek, the sheriff stopped by the diner for a cup of coffee and a chance to gather his thoughts. The place was nearly empty, the jukebox humming a low tune in the corner. Betty, the waitress who'd been serving slices of homemade pie since before he could remember, gave him a nod as he settled onto a stool. "You look like you've seen a ghost, John," she said, sliding a chipped mug his way. "Maybe I have," he replied, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Betty raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about those kids, aren't you? The ones from way back." He hesitated. "You know something?" She sighed and leaned in close, lowering her voice. "My grandmother used to talk about them. She said the whole class just vanished one day. No one ever spoke about it again. Folks were scared, like they thought if they mentioned it, they'd disappear too." The sheriff nodded slowly, the pieces starting to form a bigger picture in his mind. Fear had a way of turning truth into legend. But he needed more than old stories. He needed proof. He spent the next few days piecing together the lives of the children. He found an old photograph in the Historical Society's archives, a group of children in handmade clothes, standing in front of the old schoolhouse. Their faces were bright, filled with that easy innocence only kids have. Mary Little Bird was there, her dark hair tied with a red ribbon. Next to her stood Tommy Bearclaw, grinning ear to ear, and quiet little Rosie Whitefeather, clutching her schoolbook like it was a treasure. Names that had been wiped from every official record, but still held onto in scraps of paper and the memories of those who were willing to talk. The sheriff spent long nights at his desk, the glow of the lamp the only light in his office. He read every newspaper from that year, looking for even the smallest clue. In a June 1930 edition of the Pine Creek Herald, he found a curious line in a column about the annual Harvest Festival. The children's performance was postponed indefinitely. No reason given, no follow-up. Just another loose thread in a mystery that was quickly becoming an obsession. On a hunch, he decided to visit the only person in town who had lived through those years firsthand, Eleanor Crow. She was 93 and still sharp as a tack, her memory as strong as the scent of cedar in her little cottage at the edge of town. When he knocked on her door, she invited him in with a soft smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "You're digging into old ghosts, Sheriff," she said as she poured him a cup of herbal tea. "I'm trying to find the truth," he said simply. Eleanor nodded. It was a different time back then. People didn't always ask questions when they should have. My older brother was in that class. I was just a little girl, but I remember the day they disappeared. Mama told me to hush when I asked about them. Said it was better to let sleeping dogs lie. "Did she ever tell you why?" he asked. Eleanor shook her head. "No, but there were always whispers. My father used to say the forest took them back. Some folks believed the land itself was angry, that it wanted to keep what was rightfully its own." The sheriff frowned. "The forest." She nodded. "This land was once sacred to the indigenous people here. They believed it was alive in ways we can't understand. My father said if you didn't show respect, it would take something precious from you. But who knows if that's just a story to keep kids in line." He left Eleanor's house with more questions than answers, but something in her voice stuck with him. There was a weight to her words, a sadness that went deeper than just a tale. He felt it in his bones, that this mystery was more than just a simple case of missing children. There was something else, something tied to the land and the people who had lived here long before Pine Creek had a name. The sheriff decided to follow the trail of the children's final day. According to the scraps of the attendance records, the class had gone on a nature trip to the river that morning, a treat for finishing the school year. It was supposed to be a day of laughter and splashing in the cool water. But something had happened between the banks of that river and the walls of the school. He hiked out to the river the next morning, the mist clinging to the surface like a memory. The place was quiet, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a loon. He could almost see them there, little feet kicking up water, skipping stones across the gentle current. But as he looked closer, he saw signs that something darker might have been hidden under that calm surface. There were old stone markers tucked into the riverbank, half buried in moss and earth. They looked like they'd been there forever, their carvings worn smooth by the years. Sheriff Carmichael reached out and touched one of the stones, feeling the cold beneath his fingertips. It was covered in symbols he didn't recognize, but they felt important, like a warning or a promise. He snapped a few photos with his Polaroid, the images ghostly in the pale light. Back in town, he took the photos to Reverend Markham, the local minister and something of a history buff. The Reverend frowned as he studied them, his brow furrowing. "These symbols, they're old," he said. "Older than this town by centuries. Some of them look like protective runes, maybe even prayers to the land itself. But I've never seen them used together like this. It's unsettling." "Could they have anything to do with the children?" the sheriff pressed. Reverend Markham sighed. "I don't know. But if the children were near these stones that day, maybe they saw something they shouldn't have. Or maybe they were part of something they didn't understand. The sheriff left the church with his mind spinning. He felt like he was getting closer to the heart of it all, but every step forward seemed to open up new shadows. The deeper he dug, the more he realized this wasn't just about the children. It was about the town itself, about the promises made long before any of them were born. That night, he sat in his office, the wind rattling the window panes, and wrote down every clue, every scrap of memory he'd gathered. He didn't know what he was looking for exactly, but he knew he couldn't stop. The children of 1930 deserved to be found, even if their names had been lost to history. As he sat there, lost in thought, the phone rang, jolting him from his reverie. It was a voice he didn't recognize, low and crackling on the line. "You're getting too close, Sheriff," the voice said. "Leave it alone." The line went dead before he could answer. He stared at the receiver, the weight of those words sinking into his chest. Whoever was on the other end knew something they didn't want him to find. But Sheriff Carmichael wasn't about to turn back now. The mystery of the vanished class had become his own, a promise to the children whose laughter still echoed in the empty halls of that abandoned schoolhouse. The truth was out there, somewhere between the river's edge and the deep woods, waiting in the dark. And he was ready to find it, no matter how deep he had to go. Sheriff Carmichael sat for a long time after the phone call, the receiver still in his hand. The voice had been calm, almost gentle, but the message was clear. Back off. He knew he couldn't do that. Not now. Not after everything he'd uncovered. But the warning felt like a line drawn in the sand, a boundary he was about to cross whether he wanted to or not. The next morning, he drove out to the old schoolhouse again, the air cool and damp with early autumn rain. The building stood there like a monument to the past, every brick and boarded window holding secrets he was determined to bring to light. He walked the halls, pausing at the classroom where the children's desks still sat in a frozen moment of time. It felt like he could hear whispers in the corners, the rustle of paper, the soft giggle of a little girl's voice. But when he turned, there was nothing there, only the echo of footsteps in the empty hall. He knew he needed help. He'd been following these threads alone for too long. So he called in an old friend, Lily Martinez, a historian who'd grown up in Pine Creek and had a passion for uncovering the forgotten stories of her people. She was part of the Indigenous community here, her family rooted in the land long before the town's founding. When she arrived that afternoon, her dark eyes took in the sheriff's face with a kind of quiet understanding. "John, what are you hoping to find?" she asked as they stood in the shadow of the schoolhouse. "The truth," he said simply. She nodded. "Then we'll find it. But you have to understand, this is more than just history. These stories are still alive for some of us. They're wounds that never fully healed." He nodded. He knew she was right. But he also knew that these children deserved more than just to be remembered. They deserved justice, even if it was long overdue. Together, they started piecing together what they knew. Lily brought old maps and records, stories passed down through her family. She showed him an ancient trail that wound through the woods, marked by the same kind of stones he'd seen by the river. It was a path that had been walked for generations, a place of ceremony and memory. "My grandmother told me these trails were sacred," she said softly as they stood by the first marker, half buried in moss. "They connect us to the land and to each other." When the children disappeared, some believed the land had called them back. The sheriff listened, the weight of her words settling over him like the hush of the forest itself. It was hard for him to see beyond the facts he'd grown up with, law and order, black and white. But standing here with Lily, he felt something bigger at play, something that didn't fit into any of the neat boxes he'd been taught to believe in. They decided to talk to more families, to gather as many stories as they could. One by one, They knocked on doors, sat in living rooms where the air smelled of cedar and old photographs lined the walls. Some people were willing to talk. Others closed the door before a single word was spoken. But the ones who did share told the same story in different voices. A class trip to the river, a sudden hush, and then nothing. The children were there one moment and gone the next, as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. One night, they sat around a campfire behind a sheriff's house, going over the names again. Mary Little Bird, Tommy Bearclaw, Rosie White Feather, names that had been lost to time, but still lived in the hearts of those who remembered. Lily traced the names in the dirt with a stick, her brow furrowed. "My uncle used to say the river is alive," she murmured, "that it holds the memories of those who came before. Maybe the children saw something by the water that day. Maybe they crossed over into that memory and couldn't find their way back." The sheriff looked into the fire, the orange light flickering in his eyes. Or maybe someone wanted them gone. Someone who didn't want their stories told. The possibility hung between them like the smoke from the fire. The sheriff knew that Pine Creek had its share of secrets, old feuds that went back generations. He couldn't help but wonder if the children had become a part of that, caught up in something bigger than any of them. The next day, he paid another visit to Old Man Henry, the reclusive figure who seemed to know more than he let on. The old man was waiting on his porch, a pipe clutched in his gnarled hand, eyes sharp under the brim of his hat. "You're back," he said. "Thought I told you to leave it alone." "I can't," the sheriff replied. "These children, they deserve to be found." Henry took a long drag on his pipe, the smoke curling around his face like a veil. "You're poking at something that's been buried for a reason. But if you're determined, I'll tell you what I know." The sheriff leaned in, listening as Henry spoke in a low voice. "My father was there that day. He was just a boy himself, but he saw it. He said the children went into the forest, following something they couldn't see. He tried to stop them, but it was like they were under a spell. And when they crossed that line, the old boundary, he said the forest swallowed them whole." "A boundary?" Lily asked, her eyes wide. Henry nodded. "The land doesn't forget. The children, they're part of it now. And some folks around here would rather let them stay lost than bring back what was taken." The sheriff felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know if he believed in curses or spirits, but he knew one thing for sure. Someone was hiding the truth, and they were willing to go to great lengths to keep it buried. As they drove back to town, Lily spoke softly, her voice filled with the weight of generations. "John, we have to be careful. If what Henry said is true, we're not just dealing with old stories. We're dealing with something that's still alive in this place." The sheriff nodded. He could feel in the air, in the way the trees seemed to watch them as they passed. The children's laughter, the songs they sang on that final day, they lingered like a melody half remembered, pulling him deeper into the mystery. They decided to spend the night at the old schoolhouse, hoping to find some clue they'd missed before. They set up a small lantern in the corner, the warm light flickering over the worn desks and chalkboard. The sheriff sat at the teacher's desk, running his fingers over the names carved into the wood, names that no longer had a place in the town's records. Lily wandered the room, her fingers brushing the faded letters on the blackboard. "We will return," she read aloud, her voice a whisper in the dark. "It feels like a promise, or maybe a warning." They sat in silence, the weight of those words pressing in around them. Outside, the wind rattled the old windows, and the forest beyond seemed to hold its breath. The sheriff couldn't help but feel they were being watched, the eyes of the past fixed on them from the shadows. Around midnight, Lily stood and walked to the window, peering out into the dark. "Do you hear that?" she asked. The sheriff joined her, listening. At first, it was just the wind, but then he heard it too, a faint sound, like the echo of children's laughter carried on the night air. He felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. They stepped outside, the night cold and still. The sound grew louder, a chorus of voices that seemed to drift through the trees. They followed it, moving past the edge of the schoolyard and into the woods beyond. The lantern's light danced across the forest floor, catching on twisted roots and ancient stones. The voices led them deeper, until they reached a clearing ringed by tall pines. In the center was a circle of stones, the same kind they'd seen by the river. The laughter stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving a silence so deep it felt like the world had stopped breathing. The sheriff knelt by one of the stones, brushing away the leaves to reveal a symbol carved deep into the rock. It was the same protective rune Reverend Markham had spoken of, a sign of something old and powerful. Lily knelt beside him, her face pale in the lantern's glow. "This is a place of memory," she whispered, "a place where the land and the past come together." The sheriff felt it too, the sense that they were standing on a line between worlds, between what was and what might still be. He didn't know what they would find if they kept digging, but he knew they couldn't stop. Not now. They sat there in the clearing, the forest around them a wall of dark and secrets. Somewhere in the distance, the river whispered its ancient song, and in the heart of the sheriff's chest, the promise of those children's laughter still echoed, pulling him deeper into the shadows. Sheriff Carmichael sat in the clearing, the night around him thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The circle of stones seemed to glow softly in the lantern's light, the ancient carvings flickering like ghosts. Lily sat beside him, her eyes closed, breathing in the quiet hum of the forest. He felt a weight in his chest, a sense that they were standing at the edge of something vast and unseen, and every part of him was telling him to turn back. But he couldn't, not now. They spent the night in that clearing, listening to the whispers of the wind and the soft rustle of leaves overhead. Just before dawn, they packed up and made their way back to town, their footsteps heavy with everything they'd felt out there. Neither of them spoke much during the walk, but the sheriff kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the children's faces peeking out from behind the trees. Back in town, the sheriff pored over the names again. Mary Littlebird, Tommy Bearclaw, Rosie Whitefeather, each one a piece of a puzzle he was desperate to solve. He thought about the phone call, the warning that had come from somewhere close. He didn't know who was trying to keep him from finding the truth, but he could feel them getting closer, like a shadow creeping along the edge of his vision. He decided to pay another visit to Reverend Markham. The church was quiet that morning, the wooden pews bathed in pale light from the stained glass windows. The Reverend was kneeling at the altar, his head bowed in silent prayer. When he looked up, there was something in his eyes, a flicker of fear that hadn't been there before. "Sheriff," he said, rising slowly, "you've been busy. I need to know." "Reverend," the sheriff said, his voice firm but quiet. "You told me those runes were protective. What were they protecting? Or who?" The Reverend hesitated, then motioned for him to sit. "Those symbols, they're older than anything we have written down. They were meant to keep something in, or maybe keep something out. My grandfather used to say that there are places in this world where the line between the living and the dead is thin, and the children, they wandered too close." The sheriff frowned. "But why them? Why that class?" Reverend Markham shook his head. "I don't know, but I do know that the land remembers, and sometimes it demands a price." The words sent a shiver down the sheriff's spine. He thanked the Reverend and stepped back outside into the morning light, the air crisp and bright. But even the sun couldn't shake the chill that clung to him. He drove back to his office, feeling the pieces of the mystery starting to come together like jagged shards of glass. But one question still gnawed at him. Who had called him, telling him to leave it alone? Who was so afraid of the truth coming out? He found Lily waiting for him at the station, a stack of old papers in her hands. "I found something," she said, her voice tight with excitement and fear. These are from the tribal records. They talk about a ceremony that was held in these woods long before the town was here. It was a way to honor the spirits of the land, to keep them calm, to keep them safe. But if the ceremony was broken, bad things would happen. The sheriff took the papers, his eyes scanning the faded words. "And you think that's what happened?" Lily nodded. "The children were there that day, near the river, near those stones. Maybe they stumbled into something they didn't understand. Or maybe someone led them there." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. He thought of Old Man Henry's story, of how the children had been drawn into the woods, following something no one else could see. And he wondered who or what had led them. They decided to go back out to the river that night. They took only what they needed: a lantern, a notebook, and the quiet determination that had been growing in both of them since the first day they'd started digging into this mystery. The river was a silver ribbon in the moonlight, the air cool and still. They followed the bank, stopping at the places where the old markers stood half-hidden in the undergrowth. The symbols glowed faintly in the lantern's light, each one a silent witness to the children's last day. As they moved deeper into the woods, the sheriff felt the air grow heavier, each breath filled with the scent of earth and something older, something that felt like memory itself. Lily walked ahead, her hand brushing against the rough bark of the trees, her voice low as she spoke in the old language of her people. Then they heard it, a soft cry, like a child's voice carried on the wind. It was faint, but it was there, and it stopped them both in their tracks. "Did you hear that?" Lily whispered, her eyes wide. The sheriff nodded, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver out of instinct. They followed the sound, each step taking them closer to the heart of the forest. The cry came again, clearer this time, and the sheriff felt his pulse quicken. They reached a small clearing where the moonlight fell in a pale circle on the ground. In the center stood another ring of stones, these ones older, their edges worn smooth by time. The cry was louder here, echoing off the trunks of the trees like a memory that refused to die. Lily knelt by one of the stones, her fingers tracing the carvings. "These are different," she said softly. "They're not just protective, they're binding." The sheriff frowned. "Binding what?" She looked up at him, her eyes full of the weight of the past. "The spirits, the children's spirits. Someone trapped them here." He felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. "Who would do that?" Lily's voice was barely a whisper. "Someone who wanted them to stay lost. Someone who didn't want their stories told." The sheriff felt the pieces click into place, the outlines of a truth too big to ignore. He thought of the phone call, the fear in Reverend Markham's voice, the way Old Man Henry had spoken of the forest swallowing the children whole. And he knew, deep in his gut, that they were close, dangerously close. They spent the rest of the night in that clearing, the air thick with the past and the promise of what lay ahead. As dawn broke, they packed up their things and started the long walk back to town, their minds racing with everything they'd uncovered. Back at the station, the sheriff spread out the notes and maps on his desk, the pieces of the puzzle finally starting to take shape. But there was one more thing he needed to do, one more person he needed to talk to. He went to see Old Man Henry one last time, hoping to hear the truth straight from the only living witness to that long-ago day. But when he reached the cabin, the door was open, the place silent and still. Inside, the fire had burned down to embers, and Henry was gone. The sheriff searched the cabin, his heart pounding in his chest. On the table, he found a single scrap of paper, the words scrawled in a shaky hand. "The past doesn't stay buried. Be careful." He left the cabin, the morning light turning the forest gold and green. But the beauty did nothing to ease the weight in his chest. He felt the past closing in around him, the shadows of those children's voices growing louder with every step. He knew the truth was close, so close he could taste it. But he also knew that finding it might come at a price he wasn't ready to pay. As he walked back to his truck, the forest seemed to watch him, the rustle of leaves and the soft sigh of the wind like a warning in the silence. The children's laughter echoed in his mind, and he knew that whatever lay at the heart of this mystery, he was about to face it head-on. The climax was coming, and he could feel it in every breath, every heartbeat. The past was alive in these woods, and it was calling him deeper into the shadows. The sheriff drove back to town with the wind howling through the trees, the weight of old man Henry's note heavy in his pocket. Every mile of that narrow road seemed to stretch on forever, each bend and turn feeling like it was watching him. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was tracking his every move, waiting for the moment he would slip up. When he reached his office, Lily was already there, her eyes red from lack of sleep. She looked up at him, her face pale. "Sheriff, something's happened," she said, her voice tight. "I went back to the tribal center this morning. Someone broke in last night. All the old records, the ones about the children and the river, they're gone. Completely wiped out." The sheriff felt a chill run down his spine. "Someone's trying to erase it all," he murmured, "to make sure nobody ever learns the truth." Lily nodded, her fingers twisting in the strap of her bag. "Whoever it is, they're scared, and that means we're close." He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "We can't stop now. We have to finish this." Lily pulled out a small, leather-bound book from her bag. "I found this in the Reverend's personal collection," she said. "It's a journal written by a missionary who lived here in the early 1900s. There's a passage about the forest and the children, about a shadow that claimed them, one by one." The sheriff took the journal, his fingers tracing the worn leather. He read the passage aloud, the words sending a shiver down his spine. The children were drawn by the river's call, led by voices that no one else could hear. "We tried to bring them back, but they were gone before we ever knew they had left. The forest took them, and the forest keeps what it claims." The words felt like a warning, an echo of everything he'd seen and heard over the past few weeks. But there was something else in the journal, a sketch of the stone circle they'd found by the river, and a single name beneath it, the binding. The sheriff looked up at Lily. "The binding," he said quietly. "That's what the Reverend called it, too. Whatever this is, it's old. Older than the town, older than any of us." They knew they had to go back. But this time, they needed more than just a flashlight and a notebook. They needed answers. That night, they went back to the clearing, their breath visible in the cold air. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the forest floor. They stood in the center of the stone circle, the ancient carvings almost glowing in the silver light. "This is it," Lily said softly. "This is where it all happened." The sheriff nodded, his eyes scanning the trees. He felt like they were being watched, the weight of 100 years pressing down on them. He took out the journal and read the next page, his voice low and steady. The binding was meant to protect the living from the dead, but it came at a cost. The children were the price, and the forest took them as payment. Lily's eyes were wide. If that's true, then the children are still here. Their spirits are bound to this place. The sheriff felt a cold sweat on his neck. Then we have to find a way to break it, to set them free. As they spoke, the air seemed to grow colder, the wind picking up and rustling the leaves. The sheriff thought he saw something move at the edge of the clearing, a flicker of white, like the hem of a dress disappearing into the trees. He took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Lily nodded, her voice barely a breath. "Yes." They followed the flicker, deeper into the forest, their lantern throwing long, dancing shadows on the trunks of ancient pines. The path twisted and turned, and with each step, the air grew heavier, the silence deeper. Suddenly, they stumbled upon something neither of them expected: an old, half-buried cabin, hidden beneath a tangle of vines and roots. The door hung open, the darkness inside like a mouth waiting to swallow them whole. "This wasn't here before," the sheriff said, his voice hoarse. Lily shook her head. "Or maybe we just weren't meant to see it until now." They stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the scent of rot. The walls were lined with shelves, covered in old jars and faded photographs. In the center of the room was a table, and on it lay a single, unmarked grave marker, a small, wooden cross with no name, no date. The sheriff knelt by the marker, his fingers brushing the rough wood. "This is where they ended up," he said softly. "Whoever brought them here, this was their final resting place." But as he looked around the room, he realized something else. The photographs on the walls, old, yellowed images of children in school uniforms, their faces solemn and blank, were the same children who had vanished all those years ago. And in each photo, standing at the back, barely visible, was a figure in black, tall, thin, and faceless. The sheriff felt his stomach turn. "Who is that?" he asked, his voice trembling. Lily's eyes were wide with fear. "I don't know, but he's in every picture. He was always there." They took the photos, tucking them carefully into Lily's bag. They knew they had to get out of that cabin, to take what they'd found and figure out what it meant. But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them, plunging them into darkness. The sheriff lunged for the door, his hands fumbling at the latch. It wouldn't budge, and the air around them seemed to thicken, pressing in on them like a vice. Lily's voice was shaking. "He doesn't want us to leave." The sheriff turned, his flashlight sweeping across the room. In the far corner, the darkness seemed to move, coalescing into the shape of a man, tall, thin, and faceless, just like in the photographs. The figure took a step forward, and the sheriff felt his knees go weak. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the tiny cabin. The figure didn't answer, but the air around them grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in. The sheriff felt a pressure in his chest, a weight that made it hard to breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished, leaving them alone in the dark. The door creaked open, the wind outside howling through the gap. They didn't waste a moment. They ran from the cabin, the forest alive around them with whispers and sighs. They didn't stop until they reached the river, the water black and glimmering under the moonlight. They stood there, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding. The sheriff looked at Lily, his voice tight. "This isn't just about the children anymore," he said. "This is something older, something that's been here long before us." Lily nodded, her face pale. "And it's not done with us yet." They knew they had to keep going, to find the rest of the truth, to face whatever was waiting in those woods. But as they stood there, the river whispering at their feet, they realized something else. They weren't just uncovering a story. They were part of it now. The forest wasn't just a place, it was alive, and it was watching. They turned back toward town, the moonlight guiding their steps. But even as they walked away, the sheriff felt the weight of those children's eyes on his back, the soft echo of their laughter and their cries carried on the wind. The second plot twist was clear now. This wasn't just a story of children lost to time. This was a story of something far older, something that demanded to be remembered. And the sheriff knew that if they didn't find a way to end it, they would become just another part of the forest's long, dark history. The sheriff and Lily trudged back to town, their feet heavy, their minds reeling. The wind had picked up, sweeping through the trees in restless sighs, and the air felt thick with secrets. They didn't speak much on the way back, each lost in thoughts of what they'd seen and what it meant. The river whispered beside them, its dark surface reflecting the moon in a way that seemed almost watchful. Back in the office, the sheriff spread out everything they'd gathered: the photographs, the scraps of journals, the notes from the tribal elders. The pieces of the puzzle lay before him, but the picture they formed was darker than he dared to imagine. Lily sat across from him, her fingers drumming nervously on the desk. "I think the children were part of some kind of ritual," she said, her voice hushed but steady. "Not just a binding. A sacrifice. That figure we saw. It's been here all along, feeding off the children's spirits. That's why they're still trapped." The sheriff nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle like a stone in his gut. "And that's why someone wanted us to stop digging. They knew that if we kept going, we'd wake whatever's been waiting out there." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the faded images of the children. Each one of those faces had a story, a life that had been stolen. He thought of Old Man Henry's warning, of the Reverend's fear, and he knew there was only one way to end this. "We need to go back to the clearing," he said quietly. "We need to finish what was started all those years ago." Lily looked up at him, her eyes wide. "How?" "We don't even know what the ritual was. We don't know how to break it." The sheriff's mind was already racing. "The old symbols," he said, "the ones carved into the stones. They're meant to contain the spirit. But if we change them, if we break the circle, we might be able to free the children." She hesitated, then nodded. "It's dangerous. If we do it wrong, I know," he said, "but we can't leave them there. We have to try." That night, they gathered what they needed: salt, sage, and the small pouch of herbs that Lily had prepared according to her grandmother's teachings. They took the journal, too, hoping its words would guide them. The air was thick with mist as they left town, the forest looming ahead like a living wall. They reached the clearing just before midnight. The moon hung overhead, a pale sentinel in the sky. The circle of stones was as they'd left it, silent and waiting. The sheriff took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 100 years pressing down on him. Lily knelt by the first stone, sprinkling the herbs in a slow, deliberate circle. She whispered in her native language, her voice calm but strong. The sheriff watched her, feeling the power in her words, the connection to something deeper and older than he could ever know. When she finished, she looked up at him. "Are you ready?" He nodded. "Let's do it." Together, they began to scratch new symbols into the stones, changing the old lines, breaking the pattern. The sheriff's hands shook as he worked, each stroke feeling like a battle against the darkness that surrounded them. The air seemed to crackle with energy, the forest holding its breath. As they worked, the wind picked up, swirling around them in angry gusts. The sheriff could feel it, something watching, something moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. He forced himself to keep going, the final symbol almost done. Then a voice rang out behind them, cold and sharp. "Stop!" They turned to see Reverend Markham standing at the edge of the clearing, his eyes wide and wild. His hand clutched a small, black book, and his face was pale in the moonlight. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "You're not breaking the binding. You're breaking the seal. If you do this, you'll set it free." The sheriff stared at him, the pieces clicking together in his mind. "You knew," he said quietly. "You knew this whole time." The Reverend's shoulders slumped. "I didn't want to believe it. My grandfather told me stories of the children of the shadow that took them. He said it would sleep as long as the circle held. But if it broke," he swallowed, his voice cracking, "it will come back." Lily stepped forward, her voice steady. "It's already here, Reverend. The children are trapped. We have to free them." The Reverend shook his head, tears glistening in his eyes. "You don't know what you're doing." But it was too late to stop. The sheriff turned back to the stone, the final symbol almost complete. He carved the last line, the final stroke that would change everything. The wind roared, and the air seemed to shudder around them. A low, keening sound rose from the stones, the earth itself trembling. The sheriff felt it in his bones, a deep, ancient power, waking from a long sleep. In the center of the clearing, the shadows gathered, twisting and writhing like smoke. The shape of the figure began to form, tall and faceless, its presence colder than death. The children's laughter and cries echoed through the trees, a chorus of voices that broke his heart. The sheriff took a step forward, his voice strong. "We're not afraid of you," he said. "This ends tonight." The figure didn't speak, but the forest seemed to close in around them, the air thick with darkness. The sheriff raised the pouch of herbs, sprinkling the last of them into the circle. Lily joined him, her voice rising in a song older than memory, a song to guide the children home. The figure reached out, its shadowy hand stretching toward them. The sheriff felt a pressure in his chest, a weight that threatened to crush him. He closed his eyes, thinking of the children, Mary, Tommy, Rosie, and he pushed back with everything he had. The light of the moon flared, and the circle of stones seemed to glow from within. The shadows shrieked, a sound that cut through the night like a blade. Then, with a final roar, the figure shattered, its darkness exploding into nothingness. The clearing fell silent. The wind died down, and the forest seemed to sigh, the weight lifting. The sheriff opened his eyes, and for a moment he thought he saw the children standing in the moonlight, their faces peaceful at last. Then they were gone, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves in their wake. The sheriff turned to Lily, his chest heaving. "It's over," he said, his voice rough. "We did it." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "They're free now." Reverend Markham sank to his knees, his head in his hands. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I thought I was protecting them." The sheriff put a hand on his shoulder. "You tried," he said, "but the truth needed to be told." They gathered their things and started the long walk back to town. The forest was quiet now, the tension that had hung over it for so long finally broken. The sheriff felt lighter, like a burden he hadn't known he was carrying had finally been lifted. As they reached the edge of the trees, Lily turned to him, her brow furrowed. "Do you think it's really gone?" she asked. He looked back at the clearing, the stones still faintly glowing in the moonlight. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think the children are at peace. And that's what matters." They returned to town in the early dawn light, the sky painted with streaks of gold and pink. The sheriff knew that things would never be the same. Not for him, not for Lily, not for the town. But he also knew that the truth had been set free, and that was worth everything they'd been through. He walked into his office, the weight of the past finally lifting from his shoulders. But as he sat down at his desk, he saw a small, dark figure in the corner of the room. Just for a moment, a flicker of shadow and cold. He blinked, and it was gone. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. The past was never really gone, he realized, but it was no longer holding them prisoner. The final twist settled in his gut, a quiet, unsettling feeling that maybe, just maybe, the darkness wasn't finished yet. But for tonight, at least, the children were free, and he would let them rest in peace. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of the sheriff's office, casting long stripes of light across the worn wooden floor. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh as he looked over the scattered notes and photographs that told the story of the vanished children. It felt like a lifetime had passed since they first uncovered the records of the missing Indigenous class. And now, with the shadows banished from the clearing, he finally felt a sense of closure. Lily sat across from him, her dark hair falling over her shoulders as she traced a finger along one of the photographs. The air felt lighter, but there was still a weight to it, a quiet understanding that what they'd faced in the forest was just a piece of a much larger history. "They're at peace now," she said softly, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who knew the ways of spirits and memory. "The children can rest, and the land can heal." The sheriff nodded. "It's what we came here to do, to give them back their names, their stories." He paused, his eyes lingering on the photo of young Mary, her eyes bright with a curiosity that would never fade. "They'll never be forgotten again." Reverend Markham walked in just then. His shoulders still stooped with the guilt he carried, but his face was softer than before. He held a small wooden box, its edges worn smooth by years of careful handling. "I found this in the church archives," he said, setting it down on the desk. "It's the last journal of my grandfather. I think it explains why he kept this secret for so long." The sheriff opened the box, the scent of old paper and cedar filling the room. The journal was filled with neat, careful handwriting, telling of a time when the church and the settlers believed they were doing the right thing. It spoke of fear of what they didn't understand, of spirits they thought were vengeful, of children who spoke of dreams and visions that the adults could never accept. He thought he was saving them, the sheriff said quietly, closing the journal. But in the end, he was just another piece of the silence that kept them trapped. Markham looked down at his hands. "I know," he said, "and I'm sorry. I'll spend the rest of my days making sure this never happens again." Lily reached out, her touch gentle. "That's all any of us can do. Acknowledge what was lost and honor what remains." The sheriff stood, stretching out his tired limbs. "We should return the journal to the families," he said. "They deserve to know the truth, to see that their children's voices have been heard at last." They spent the rest of the day driving from house to house, sharing what they'd found. The families took the photographs and the stories with quiet reverence, their eyes shining with tears and relief. The sheriff saw how the burden lifted from their shoulders, how the knowledge that their children's spirits were free gave them a peace that had eluded them for decades. When they returned to town that evening, Lily took the sheriff's hand, her eyes bright with a smile that reached deep inside him. "You did good," she said. "You gave them back their names. You gave them back their light." He smiled back, feeling the truth of her words settle into his bones. "We did it together." As night fell, they gathered in the town square, where the elders had decided to hold a small ceremony to honor the children's memories. A circle of candles flickered in the dark, each flame a small beacon of hope and remembrance. The wind was soft and warm, carrying the sweet scent of sage and cedar. One by one, the elders spoke the names of the children, their voices strong and clear in the still night. The sheriff closed his eyes and let the words wash over him, feeling the weight of history being lifted, carried away by the night air. When it was his turn, he stepped forward and spoke of what they'd seen in the forest, the shadows and the songs, the fear and the courage it took to face the past. He spoke of the children's laughter, of the love that still lived in their memories, and of the promise they'd made to never let them be forgotten again. Lily stood beside him, her head bowed in prayer. When the last name was spoken, the candles flickered brighter, as if the children's spirits had gathered to hear their names one final time. The sheriff felt a quiet peace settle over the square, a sense that the children were there with them, free at last. After the ceremony, the sheriff and Lily walked back to his office one last time. The night was cool and clear, the stars bright above them. The air smelled of earth and possibility, like the world was finally ready to begin healing. Inside the office, he poured them each a cup of coffee, the familiar clink of the mugs grounding him in the present. Lily leaned back in her chair, her eyes soft and tired. "What will you do now?" she asked. He thought about it for a moment, the weight of the past finally easing from his shoulders. "I'll keep doing what I've always done," he said. "Protect this town, listen to the voices that have been silenced for too long." She smiled. "That's all any of us can do. Keep listening. Keep remembering." He nodded, and for a long moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the warmth of the coffee and the quiet of the night wrapping around them like a promise. The next morning, the sheriff rose early and walked out to the edge of town, where the river met the forest. The water flowed steady and sure, a quiet, constant witness to all that had come before. He stood there for a while, breathing in the cool air, feeling the peace of the place settle around him. He thought of the children, their laughter echoing in the back of his mind. He thought of the forest, the spirits that watched and waited, and of the promise he'd made to never forget. He knew there would always be shadows, always be things hidden in the dark, but he also knew that there was light in the names, in the memories, in the hearts of the people who kept them alive. As he turned back toward town, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. The past would always be a part of them, but it didn't have to define them anymore. The children were free, and in their freedom, the town had found its own way forward. The sheriff knew there would be more stories to tell, more mysteries to uncover, but for now, he was content. He walked back slowly, the rising sun painting the world in gold, and he carried with him the promise of the past and the hope of the future. And somewhere, in the rustling leaves and the quiet hum of the river, he thought he could hear the children's laughter, a soft, gentle echo that would never fade.